Stephanie. All right, so you're not going to hear too much from me, but I get the pleasure of introducing the all-star lineup we have here of biologists from all over the state. So you have a nice smattering of regional and central office staff here. So start with Mandy. She's our Furbearer biologist here in central office. So she helps oversee specifically the species group that we're going to be talking about. Tim Pazinski is a regional wildlife manager up in Region 6, which is along St. Lawrence. He's been on the fur team and involved in Furbearer management for a while now. Jen Pettit is out in Region 9 in Western New York and also has been on the fur team for quite a while now. Jolie Tooley is a collaborator at Cornell University working on the SnapShotNY program. So she specifically deals with our community science aspect of that project, and she's going to be talking about that in a little bit. It's a really exciting new program. Leslie Lupo is down in Region 1. It's been with DEC for a while now down there. So that's Suffolk County, Nassau County on Long Island. And I'm Josh Stiller. I'm a small game unit leader, of which Furbearers are part of. So with that, I won't have any more delay. I'm going to pass it off to Mandy so she can kick us off here.
All righty. Well, welcome everybody. Like Josh said, my name is Mandy Watson. I am a Furbearer biologist based out of our Albany office. And I'm just going to kind of start off with kind of a brief overview, just going through what exactly a Furbearer is. And I would just like to say, as we go through this presentation today, please feel free to ask any questions, put them in that Q&A button that you have to all panelists, and we're happy to answer them. All right, so, what is a Furbearer? This is a question that we get a lot, not actually a bear. And what it is it's just a general term that's used to describe species that have historically been hunted or trapped primarily for their fur. And here in New York and throughout the country, Furbearers are a very diverse group of species. So in New York, we have our semi-aquatic Furbearers, which are those that spend time on land and in water, and that includes beavers, river otters, mink, muskrats. We also have our, what I like to refer to as our, backyard Furbearers. So the ones that you're likely to see in more suburban areas and that I'm sure most folks are familiar with, such as the raccoon, skunk, striped skunks, the Virginia opossum as well. And then we have our land-dwelling mustelids, which are part of the weasel family. So we have our fisher and our American marten, as well as both long and short-tailed weasels. And then we have our canids. So we've got the eastern coyote, we have gray foxes, red foxes, and finally we have our one wildcat species, the bobcat. So it's just kind of a quick overview of all of the Furbearers that we have here in New York. And, as I mentioned, really the one thing that ties all of these species together, it's a very diverse group, a lot of differences there, but the one thing that ties them together is that these species are all highly valued by trappers. So for their fur, but also for other things as well. As I'm sure many of you know, we have a long history of trapping in New York, and you really can't talk about Furbearer management without talking about regulated trapping. So our state was built on beaver trapping. However, the trapping of today looks very different than it did way back when. So trapping today is highly regulated. So it can only be done by licensed trappers. So they have to have a valid trapping license. They have to have completed a mandatory trapper education course as well. All laws and regulations are enforced by environmental conservation officers. And we here at DEC the main part of our job here is continuously reviewing and developing rules, regulations, recommendations, education programs, and so on that really consider the most up-to-date science on trapping in our fur bearers, and that take into account animal welfare and things like that. And really the most important thing is that all of these fur-bearing species in New York, even though many of them are elusive and not seen very often, they are all abundant species. So trapping is only done on species that are abundant. We very closely monitor our trapping harvest and our fur-bearer populations to ensure that these species are going to be around for generations to come. And regulated trapping has many benefits. So, trapping is a legitimate use of the wildlife resource. So it is, trappers will use many different parts of the animals. It's not all about the fur. They will also may use the fur for clothing. They'll use the meat. They use scent glands, things like that. So really these animals are used. And trappers view trapping as a historic part or an important part of their heritage and a way to remain connected to the outdoors. But for some other benefits as well, is trapping can be very useful for reducing conflicts with wildlife. So, in New York, we have a very robust beaver population. We get a lot of issues with beaver, conflicts with beaver that are being reported from flooding, breaking of dams, taking out roads, buildings, property, things like that. And so trapping is used to help mitigate some of these conflicts. Some other examples might be coyotes or raccoons that may be damaging property. And another thing is that trapping of predators can actually help protect some endangered species. So it's, piping plovers, if we have anybody down in region 1 on Long Island, where predators can do a number on those nesting birds, trapping is really, really relied heavily on to protect those populations. And another really big thing with trapping that a lot of folks may not think about is it is critical for our research and reintroduction programs as well. So in New York, we reintroduced river otters, which I'll be talking a little bit about later. And almost all of those otters that were moved, so it was 279 otters that were moved primarily from the eastern part of the state, mostly in the Adirondacks in the northern zone, were trapped by volunteer trappers who went out and set live traps for these otters, and then we moved them to the western part of the state as part of this reintroduction program. And we also rely very heavily on trappers for many of our research projects that we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be talking about bobcats and fishers and some of the recent research that DEC has been doing. And trappers have been absolutely critical in helping us really get our hands on these animals and put out collars and things like that you'll hear a lot more about later on in the program. And it's also just really important. It gives us a really good data source on getting information about some of these more elusive critters that we don't necessarily get to see that often. So, we have asked trappers multiple different times to submit different parts of the animals that they trap, whether it be their carcasses, teeth, things like that. And then we can do a whole number of different sampling and stuff on that. We can get an idea of age structure from the teeth. We've had trappers submit reproductive tracks so that we know how many young they may be having and how often these different animals are having young. It's really, really important for us as biologists. It gives us a really important resource here. And so, I mentioned that both trapping and our fur-bearer species are very closely monitored by us at DEC. And this is just kind of a broad overview of how we collect some of that information, how we use it. So we do have a lot of what we call harvest-dependent information. So this is stuff that we get directly from trappers and fur-bearer hunters. So if we have any trappers in the audience, I'm sure you know that we send you a lot of different things, surveys and whatnot. And we really, really appreciate that. And we do really use that data. So some of the things that we do is we have pelt sealing. So we have mandatory sealing. So a DEC staff member has to go out and manually put on a plastic tag on all harvested bobcats, river otters, American marten, and fisher. So we can very closely track the harvest of those species. For our other species, we will track harvest through an annual trapper mail survey. So we send out a survey to 4,500 different trappers, which we average about 14,000 trappers in the state. So this is a very big sample of our trappers, asking folks to report what species they trapped, how many they trapped, and also their effort. So this gives us a really good idea of, take per unit effort. So we can use that to kind of get an idea of how our populations may be doing. And for some of our species, like the American marten, we will actually even more closely track effort by having trappers fill out what's known as activity logs, where they go out and they say how many traps they set for how many nights and what they caught and when. And that just really helps us understand trapping or trapping harvest and these different populations much better. And like I mentioned previously, we will also request samples from certain harvested animals as well that we can then use to test for a myriad of different things or to learn more about. One of the things we have going on right now is we collected carcasses from harvested fishers and gray foxes last year. And we have sent those as part of a northeastern study, a regional study. And we've sent those samples to a group of wildlife veterinarians and pathologists who are doing really comprehensive health screening. They're looking for the presence of anticoagulant rodenticides in these animals, for different heavy metals in these animals, and also testing for different diseases. So we're hoping to have results from that. But that's just kind of one example of one of the things that we can do here when we are asking, like with the cooperation of trappers who are fantastic. And then we also have what's known as harvest independent data as well. So these are not reliant on folks actually trapping the animals. And this includes things such as observation reports. So there's that QR code there. And if you scan that, that brings us to, or that will bring you to our Furbearer public sighting survey, which is a survey asking members of the public to report sightings of certain fur-bearer species that they may see, and they can upload pictures and videos. We have gotten over 1,400 reports since the survey went live just about a year ago, which has been really great. And that is really, really helpful for helping us understand more about where some of these rare species are and their habitat use and behavior in some of these like urban and suburban areas that we don't necessarily get that much information from. And then another one is just dedicated research projects. So, this can include things such as camera surveys, track and sign surveys, going out to see what we can detect, mark recapture surveys, which can be used to estimate just how many animals are out there, putting VHF or GPS collars on the animals to get a better idea of how they're moving, things like that. And so, that's just kind of an example of some of the different things. We're going to be talking a lot more about some of this stuff, particularly some of our harvest independent research that we've been doing. But if you want to know more about really everything that we're doing with fur bearers that we may not have time to cover tonight, I would recommend that everybody check out our Furbearer newsletter. So this is an annual newsletter that DEC's Furbearer management team puts out. We just released this fall version a couple weeks ago. So this is all new. You can either scan that QR code and it will bring you right to this newsletter, or you can follow that link on the screen, and that will bring you to our trapping page, which you can then find there's a little box, a call out box for that newsletter. So if you want to read anything more about our harvest numbers or, the data from those activity logs and whatnot, I highly recommend you guys check that out. So that is all that I have, is just kind of a brief overview. And now we're going to pass it over to Tim, and he's going to talk about some of our fisher research. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Mandy. So again, I'm the Regional Wildlife Manager in Region 6, and I get the opportunity to talk to you all a little bit about Fisher this evening, particular about one project that I was able to work on between 2018 and 2021. Just as a heads up, I don't see the slides yet. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So before we get into that, I think generally most folks probably in on this call have an understanding of what a fisher is, but maybe not. So we want to clear that up before we dive in any further. But identifying characteristics, fisher are a land-bearing species. They're dark-haired member of the weasel family, large as compared to a weasel or a mink. As you see there below, males are between 7 and 15 pounds and females weighing between 3 and 7 pounds. So some of our females do get confused with other mustelid species like a mink, like a large adult male mink could be close to the size of a female fisher. And then same with marten in that range in the central Adirondacks where marten and fisher overlap. If you have a small female fisher, there could be some confusion with a marten. But their color does range. It can be very, very dark black to a light grizzly brown. A lot of the fisher, they have that kind of patch as you see in this photo where there's some white. I've also seen it where it is even kind of orangey colored, but generally white because that orangey color is kind of distinctive of marten as well. But we can move on to the next slide. So common misconceptions. There's a lot of them wrapped around fisher. I feel like especially in Western New York where fisher over the last decade or more have been expanding their range and they're the new kid on the block. So they kind of get blamed for everything wrong going on, right? It's kind of how it goes. But overall, their diet, though they're known to be vicious killers or people, that's what people say, they're opportunistic omnivores. They have a diverse diet, includes small mammals, birds, fruit, nuts, and more. Doing the research that we did, we've seen fisher crawl up and pluck out young in the year wood ducks, have them walking around with apples in their mouths, walking around with chipmunks. I've seen a den that had a deer leg in it. So I want to be clear, they're not taking deer, but they're scavenging on them as well. So they're opportunistic and they're going to get their mouth on anything that they can. Fisher cat, a lot of folks call them fisher cats. They're nowhere near and related to a cat other than they don't like water. We have seen videos of them swimming across bodies of water, but if they can avoid it, they will do so. So maybe that's why they got that designation as a fisher cat, but nowhere near closely related to a cat. And then lastly, screaming fishers. We've all heard that. You hear that noise out there, that's one of those crazy fisher. So, but not necessarily. Fisher do have some vocalizations. Maybe that's another reason why they kind of were associated with a cat, because it's almost like a purr when you have them in hand, which most people are not going to have them in hand. But they do not scream or yell as most folks might assume or have heard in the past. So that is in all just kind of generally what a fisher is. So next, I'll just do a brief summary on some work that we did in the northern zone of New York. We started this project because we collect, as some of the data that Mandy had talked about that we collect from trappers, we had some data that suggests maybe our populations in the Adirondacks were declining. And as a result of that, we did reduce season length in the Adirondacks for trapper fishing or fisher trapping, excuse me. But we wanted to learn more. We wanted to know, was that change justified? What's going on with the fisher in the central Adirondacks? And to do that, we compared the fisher population in the central Adirondacks to the fisher population on the Tug Hill. Reason being, fisher population on the Tug Hill, the data that we had at the time showed that it was a robust population, though some of the characteristics on the landscape between the Tug Hill and the Adirondacks are somewhat similar, right? Large tracts of forest land, similar kind of latitude in northern New York. And we want to kind of see what was going on between those two populations. So as I explained, the study was a comparison between the Adirondacks and the Tug Hill being on our left-hand side of the screen and the Central Adirondacks being on the right-hand side of the screen. The blue dots that you see are the number of animals that we captured. So to do this study, we had to rely on contract trappers or general fur trappers that we utilized to capture animals. We capture them in tomahawk live traps. Trappers would let us know that we got a fisher. We'd grab them, immobilize them, put a collar on them, take some other biological measurements, and then release them back in the same location that they were trapped. And by doing that, we were able to get the information that I'll be able to explain here in another couple slides. So overall, between the two study areas, we between our efforts and also contract trapper efforts, we trapped close to 200 animals, 30 females, 50. Well, between the two areas in the Central Adirondacks, there's 30 females. In the Tug Hill, 51 females. And then you see in the Central Adirondacks, 48 males. And 48 males on the Tug Hill. And if you look, it's kind of interesting, and I'll get into a little bit more, but just looking at this data right here, females drive populations. You know, you need females to continue that population. And just looking between the Central Adirondacks and the Tug Hill study area, just our sample that we collected, the Tug Hill had more females, which is kind of interesting. Something that we didn't necessarily totally dive into, but you know, a fact out there that's kind of interesting that there's more females that we caught in the Tug Hill. All right, so the first thing that we were looking at is overall adult survival. You know, when we capture these animals where we were pulling a tooth, that would help us identify how old they were, so we could determine, you know, survival rates between male and females, adults and juveniles. We could try to identify what could be limiting their survival across the landscape. Like, are the fisher in the Central Adirondacks, are they overall succumbing more or as adults versus the Tug Hill? What's going on? And then in every wildlife research, the gold standard or the hope is like to identify specifically what they are dying of, but that's always easier said than done. But we did get the opportunity to identify in some cases what was actually killing the fisher on the landscape. So with that, the Tug Hill survival rates of the 99 individuals that we monitored on the Tug Hill, 9 were still alive in December 2022. So that's when we ended the study. 34 went missing or their fate was undetermined. Some of these animals, we were fortunate enough to track some juvenile females. It seemed like juvenile females would travel a lot more, but they traveled the entire Tug Hill. We had some in the Adirondacks that traveled through the entire Adirondacks. And sometimes, though we use flight and also other means to track these animals, sometimes they get lost. But another factor is a lot of times these radio collars, just you put them out and sometimes they don't work either. So unfortunately, 34 of them, we really don't have any ideas. We could just assume. 39 died. 7 were released without a collar, at least in the Tug Hill area. That could be there's an injury or something happened that we didn't feel like we should have put a collar on that animal. And then 10 slipped collars after release. And that's very common for females. For those of you who handle mustelids or know anything about mustelids, they have a real streamlined body. So the collar has to be just on there perfect, where it's tight enough not to cause any injury, but also tight enough where it's not going to fall off. So it's a really fine line. And sometimes with smaller females, those collars would fall off. So causes of death on the Tug Hill, which this is a really interesting piece of data that you should remember for the next slide, is 24 were from regulated trapping, 4 from rodenticide poisoning. And that is folks going to, various hardware store and purchasing those little bait drops and put them, in your yard or in your camp. Mice are eating those. They're going out dying. Fish are eating those mice, and they're bioaccumulating that rodenticide enough where it can kill them or cause injury. So don't do that if you can't. One from rabies, which is the picture here. I was able to climb up this tree and find this fisher, which is amazing to find a fisher that, isn't just bones. And it did end up testing positive for rabies. And then 10 were undetermined, which are pretty much those bones that we come across. In the Adirondacks, of their 78, 14 were still alive in December 2022, 27 went missing or their fate was undetermined, 25 died, and 12 had slipped collars before December 2022. Their cause of a death, so note 4 from regulated trapping, and that was a comparison of 24 in the Tug Hill, 3 from vehicle strikes, 2 from predation, 1 from ammonia, and 15 were undetermined. The picture there, the thought was that was preyed on by a coyote. Moving on, so that was what we talked about survival. So one part of that study was adult survival, seeing what's happening with those adults. The next, and really the most important part of this study, was trying to figure out reproduction and how is that going to change between the Tug Hill and the Central Adirondacks. And then how are these different factors in forest composition or prey base affecting that? Or could we make assumptions based off of what we're finding from the study? And with all these adult females, so when we have them in hand, we're identifying how old they are based off of their teeth structure and tooth wear. So we have a pretty good idea what's going to be an adult female, and those adult females got a very specific GPS collar where we could track their individual points, but it also had a component where we could track them to find their den trees. And I'll explain that in the next couple of slides on why that is important. So why that is important is because this is how we collected that reproductive data. So how many kits a female was having during the spring. That is the reproductive data that we are trying to achieve. So how did we do that? So we collared these adult females, and we are doing our trapping in the winter. Come springtime, which fisher in northern New York, generally they're having young around April 1st. Once we could monitor their GPS points, but it was best for us to go out early in the morning. And as we went out early in the morning, and there was that fisher was up in a tree, in the same tree a couple mornings in a row, we assumed that she had a litter there. Once we identified that she had a litter in that tree, or we assumed that she did, we would set trail cameras around the base of that tree. And then confirm that she had a litter, because fisher will move their den trees 4 to 5 times throughout that rearing period. So from April to June. And when they're moving those trees, because they're, they may start in a really small, tight hole. And then as the kits get bigger, they got to move on. And they're also moving on to stay ahead of other predators or other male fisher. So when they move and go down the tree, they're moving one young at a time, and we were able to capture a photograph at the base of the tree when she was moving. So that's that photo in the middle of the screen, also the photo in the bottom right. And then we just monitor them and kept doing this until about the beginning of June, when the kits were able to move on their own power. And once they're able to move on their own power, they're less likely to use one specific den tree very regularly. And we lose our ability to track them as we did early on. So with that, the Central Adirondack study area, they were able to monitor 10 females on the Tug Hill. We were able to monitor 11. And just note, it took, close to, it's about, for every 1 fisher that we caught, or every 10 fisher that we caught, 1 of them was an adult female. So we had to catch a lot of animals to get that adult female that was going to have kits that we're really trying to collect data on. The average number of kits for the Central Adirondacks was 2.1, and the average on the Tug Hill study area was 2.7 which that is a very important piece of information. As you can see, there is a difference between these two study areas. Yeah, perfect. So key findings, wrapping up here, fisher survival on the Tug Hill is much lower than the Adirondacks, but is offset by higher productivity and kit survival. So we noticed when I talked about adult survival on the Tug Hill, we had trappers take 24 of our animals, and on the Adirondacks, they had 4. So our overall harvest on the Tug Hill is higher, but in the last statistics, I said, the overall kit production for fisher in the Tug Hill was higher than in the Central Adirondacks. So though we had more mortality in the Tug Hill, that reproductive rate is much higher and is driving that population and making it more sustainable than in the Central Adirondacks. So also across both study areas, fisher survival and productivity was linked to beach mass cycles. So in springs following good beech nut production, fisher tended to produce more kits and survival rates increased. And lastly, despite risk of rodenticide exposure, which is putting those little green baits out that causes harm not just to those mice but other species, fisher survival and productivity are higher in areas with greater wild-urban interface. So those areas that are kind of sort of fragmented, that may produce more prey base, such as squirrels or chipmunks, that seems to be where fisher thrived, as opposed to a real dense, middle of the Adirondacks continuous forest stand. And that is what I got for fisher in the northern zone.
Thanks, Tim. I'll take it over from here. So let me just grab presenter mode and pull up the notes here. All right. So we are actually in the middle of a thunderstorm right here in Western New York right now. So hopefully I stay on for my entire presentation. But I am Jen Pettit. I'm a regional wildlife biologist out of the Region 9 Western New York area. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Southern Zone Fisher Camera Trap study that we did over the last several years. So a little background on the fisher population out in Central and Western New York. Like many species, they were historically found throughout upstate New York, but experienced severe population decline in the late 1800s and early 1900s due to exploitation and habitat loss, and were extirpated from most of New York at that time. As recently as the 1970s, they were only found in the Adirondack Mountains. And in the 1970s, DEC did reintroduce fishers to the Catskills using licensed trappers to assist with that. A few decades later, Pennsylvania also had a reintroduction program in the 1990s. So the fishers in Central and Western New York are coming from 2 different areas, really. So the expansion of the population out in Eastern New York, and then also the Northern Pennsylvania population expanding northward. So we wanted to get a better handle on what was going on out in Central and Western New York, and we partnered with the New York Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit out of Cornell to assist us with that. So in 2013, we launched this study, and we were looking to determine the relative abundance of fishers, specifically out in Central and Western New York, with a goal of informing future management decisions. And we accomplished this in a non-invasive technique of utilizing camera traps and also hair snares. So we set up a grid pattern in all participating regions in which we had specific parameters and site locations that we were targeting. And we would sample each site for a period of 3 weeks between the time frame of January through April. So a winter survey. We had you'll see in these two pictures with the fishers, we had a baited tree. The bait was beaver supplied by licensed trappers. So they played a crucial role in our study of providing us that bait. And surrounding the bait, all of the little things kind of sticking off the tree, those are gun brushes that were acting as hair snares. So as a fisher climbs up the tree to eat that beaver meat that is attached to the tree with some chicken wire so that they can't just rip it off, they're also rubbing against those gun brushes and depositing their hair on those gun brushes. So the reason why that was important to us is because it provides even better data. So instead of just seeing that, okay, we have this site and we have a fisher on it, but we don't know for sure if this is one fisher visiting throughout these 3 weeks or if it's many fishers. With the DNA, we can actually look at individual fishers. We also used a skunk-based lure as an attractant. So all of our coworkers and our family really loved, smelling us throughout that study period. And so the first phase, it was a 3-year study from 2013 through 2015. 2013, we were just kind of getting started and ramping up with this. So we surveyed 300 sites in 2013. In 2014 and 15, we surveyed 608 sites. And you might be looking at this map and wondering, why is there that gap at the very southern part of New York near the Pennsylvania border? And that's because we knew from other data that we were looking at, like the observation data that we are collecting from the general public, that area there seemed to have the most robust population. So we were looking to get north of that area and really kind of dial in on, what's going on in that area north and not quite all the way to the Great Lakes Plain at that point. So over these 3-year periods, we tracked where we were getting detections. And you can see on the slide, the red grid cells indicate that we had a positive detection of at least one fisher. The yellow grid cells indicate that fisher were not detected in those locations. And then the gray is just areas that we did not sample at all. And from that, we were able to construct a habitat model that related the probability of the site occupancy to landscape variables. So we looked at a positive correlation to coniferous and mixed forests and some negative correlations to the amount of road density. Also stream density and the proportion of agriculture, that did have a bit of a negative correlation, but not as much as the road density played into. So we were able to construct a habitat model to predict fisher occupancy in the locations that we were sampling, but also across the landscape as well to areas that we had not put cameras at that time. So we also were able to compare areas that were currently open for harvest to areas that were closed to fisher harvest at that time. And after we concluded these initial 3 years of camera monitoring, we put together our fisher management plan, which is a plan for the whole state. So it's not just for Central and Western New York, but in our Central and Western New York component, we proposed opening a fisher trapping season in the area in the orange, which is a season that would have been brand new to us. It is something that we started out in a very conservative way. So it was only a 6-day season. And within that 6-day season, it was very closely monitored. So in order to participate in that season, the fisher trappers needed a permit from us. They also were required to maintain an activity log so that we could gauge how much effort they were putting into trapping. Successful trappers needed to submit a lower jaw because we were able to age and sex that the tooth from that lower jaw, and also have their fisher sealed. So there were several steps in order to go ahead and participate in this season because we really wanted to have a very good handle on what was going on. Also within that fisher management plan, which is located on our website, if anyone's interested in reading more about what we plan to do with fisher in New York State, we proposed a second phase of monitoring. So after 3 years of open harvest in Central and Western New York, we went back to our camera surveys and put those cameras back out to see how the population had changed. So we did roughly 600 sites each year. We did modify our sampling design a little bit to reduce the distance between the individual sites in an effort to capture more hair from repeat individuals. So a little bit of a modification, and we did look at some different areas than we had been looking in the past, specifically in areas that had remained closed to harvest. And our key findings from this is that between 2015 and 2021, the fisher population had expanded dramatically, even just in that short period of time, but especially since the 1970s, when they were really reduced to just being in the Adirondacks. So they are now considered common throughout upstate New York. They do not currently exist on Long Island. They're also not documented to have been there historically, but in the rest of the state, they are doing wonderfully. And in this figure that you can see here, the yellow indicates the greatest likelihood of fisher presence. The dark purple or black would be the least likelihood. So you can see just from 2015 to 2021 how that's changed. Even though we did open up a trapping season in 2016, the population has still increased. And that leads into our next topic, which Josh will be talking about.
All right. Thanks, Jen. So as you guys can see, we have done a tremendous amount of research on fisher in New York State to understand kind of key vital rates and also where they are, how many there are across these areas where we have concerns or where they're starting to expand. So it gave us a really good opportunity. If you read through that fisher management plan, we set clear objectives on when we would like to see changes or when we would consider changes. And thankfully for species, this is another great conservation success story where we're seeing that population growth. We see strong numbers that indicate they're going to be doing well for a long time. And so we can revisit kind of what our management goals are, what our management strategies are, or what types of seasons we want to have to allow, this responsible use of this resource, as Mandy was talking about earlier. So we did all the research on one side, but then we want to pair that research on their abundance and all those other factors with, what do our stakeholders want? In this case, stakeholders can be different depending on what we're talking about. No matter what we do with fisher right now, we're going to make sure that it's biologically sustainable so that current and future generations are able to enjoy fisher on the landscape. But within that, we wanted to know what do trappers value and, how can we best provide opportunity for trappers around the state. And to do that, the best way we're able to do that are through these surveys of trappers or hunters or stakeholders in general. And so A while back, we did a survey of over 7,000 of our active trappers, which is more than 50%. And so we specifically asked them about their views and interests and what they value in their trapping experience. And so not going to spend a ton of time on like the kind of study design and everything else. We're just going to jump right into kind of what we found out. So these are some of the things that we knew were important to trappers from all the conversations that our staff have with them around the state. And then how it shook out in terms of what's most important. The number one most important thing to trappers was the quality of the pelts. And so in the case of Fisher, they didn't want to be trapping super early in the season when the pelts aren't prime because they're still shedding. And next most important thing was the opportunity to go trapping, because obviously, you know, what good's a season if I can't get out there because of other demands on my time or many other things that we considered. Next was the number of fish on the landscape. So, you know, obviously trappers, just like the general public, want to see a lot of fish around the landscape so they can enjoy that species. And then lastly, success. This is the least important thing to trappers. So they were least concerned with the maximizing the absolute number of fisher that they were able to trap in a season. And when we talk about opportunity, like I mentioned, there's a couple different things that means. You know, it could be access because of weather, you know, especially when we're talking about in Tim's neck of the woods up in Region 6 in the Adirondacks. You know, past a certain point, access becomes very limiting because roads are closed and it's just not easy to get around and get to these places where trappers want to trap. Season length is probably one of the more important ones, because obviously the more days you have to go trapping, the more opportunity you have to go out. And then kind of a negative interaction potentially can be other hunting seasons, you know, where they're either that kind of goes hand in hand with access, because, you know, in some situations you'd lose access because people are deer hunting on the property, or you lose opportunity because you're out deer hunting or something like that. So we asked trappers about all these things and what's most important, and we went through a rigorous decision process that kind of weighs all these things and evaluates the consequences. And kind of one thing, just last thing to touch on as far as like what trappers specifically valued, having the longest season, like I mentioned, is that number one driving factor. This is pretty much across the board usually how it shakes out, whether we're talking about hunting seasons, trapping seasons. People want opportunity, and the longer the season is, the more opportunity they have, because all those other things that get in the way, there's more likelihood that it's going to fit within your schedule. And especially for trapping, something that is very time demanding, and you know, you have mandatory check times and stuff like that, you know, it's not surprising that that comes out as the most important thing. So we take all this information, we pair the biological information with the human dimensions information, and we evaluated somewhere between 6 and 10 alternatives, like so different season lengths, different exact dates, you know, earlier, later, in the middle dates, all these different things to try. We considered a bag limit. We considered a number of different alternatives that we could do from a regulation standpoint to meet the interests of trappers and to maximize opportunity. So, and to, you know, keep population sustainable going forward. And so this is where we ended up. In Western New York, you can see that light blue area. We've kind of filled in the gap, and really what this is the product of is that those seasons are, or sorry, those areas are very similar, kind of the Southern Appalachian Plateau, and then in the middle there, when you're looking at the North Appalachian Hills, Oneida Lake Plains, and Otsego Lowlands, or Oswego Lowlands. Those are all pretty similar. So you can see before the seasons used to have this gap where you had 7A was associated with the southwestern areas. So now we have one contiguous zone, and then we proposed a different zone in the Great Lakes Plains. And so we liberalized opportunity in the current expansion area in the Western New York, expanded the area that applies to, and then we opened a very conservative season in that Great Lakes Plains, where we know we have fewer fisher, but still have a significant number of fisher. So we want to allow for more population growth in that area, and kind of we'll see where that leads us when we reevaluate again. And then by and large, a lot of the seasons were pushed back later. So that's just a really good example of how we went from, we did the science, then we did the human dimensions, and then we boiled all that information into a regulatory decision to hopefully better meet the needs of the public. So this went out for public notice, for public comment back on June 18th. That closed about a little bit over a month ago. We're in the process of reviewing and assessing that public comment, and then we would either put something else out for public comment or maybe adopt the changes. We'll see where we go from there based on that review. And if anything is adopted, just to be really clear, say we were to adopt something in the next 2 months or something like that, then it would not go into, it still wouldn't go effect till next season. So just to be really clear, we're talking about 26, 27 changes. So, and with that, I will pass it back off to Jen to talk about our next topic.
Thank you. And all right, I'm ready to go. So our next topic is some Bobcat research that we've been doing very recently. And many of you are probably very familiar with bobcats, but for those who are not, we put together some fast facts. So they are New York's only wild cat, and they are a medium-sized cat with gray to brown coat, whiskered face, black ear tufts, smaller than a Canada lynx, and about twice as large as a domestic cat. Identifying characteristics include black barring on their forelegs, white spots on the back of their ears, which is personally my favorite, but raccoons do kind of have this too, and they can trick you sometimes. Black tip tail, generally 5 to 6 inches long. In New York, they are pretty faint or indistinct spots on the body as opposed to bobcats out west. The average length and weight for males, 21 pounds, females, 14 pounds, but both sexes can exceed 30 pounds. And average length for males about 34 inches and for females about 30 inches. And as far as habitat that they're selecting for, in North America, they occupy a wide range of habitats, such as the rimrock areas of the west and arid deserts of the southwest, tropical swamps and bottomland forests of the southeast. And they're known to use agricultural areas, but avoid areas of intensive agriculture. In New York State, they also use a wide range of habitats within our state. So agriculture, but again, really kind of avoiding the areas of the state with more intensive agriculture. Brushland, forested or scrub shrub wetlands, and mature softwood or hardwood forests. And this photo is a photo that I took during our collaring project that we'll talk about in a little bit. But you can see it's a area here that's super thick. So what I would kind of say to some of our staff as we are setting these up is if it's so thick that you don't want to walk through it, that's probably where they're going to be. And this certainly was difficult to walk through. Right on the edge of a pretty big water body that we have in Region 9. So a little background on bobcats in New York State, kind of similar to Fisher. They were historically found throughout New York State. But unregulated harvests and the shifting land use when the Northeast was first settled really limited their distribution and abundance. So Long Island even had bobcats. There was actually a bounty system on there in the mid-1700s. In Long Island. They were extirpated on Long Island and Western New York by the mid-1800s. They were really treated as a pest species at that time. And although bobcats were rare in the Adirondacks due to the severe winters there, it's really not the most ideal habitat for them. It really became a holdout for them in the late 1800s because that was the area that that people weren't successful in extirpating them. So they hung on in the Adirondacks. In the 1970s, the New York State Legislature designated them as a small game species, and the bounty system was then prohibited. And at that time, the core population was found in the Taconic, Catskill, and Adirondack Mountains of New York. In the northern and southeastern part of New York, there was a highly regulated hunting and trapping season that was established in 1976, and that season structure remained mostly unchanged until 2013, when we opened some other areas of the state. But since the 1970s, the bobcat distribution has expanded across New York dramatically, including in central and western New York, where we started to document sightings in the 1990s. I won't really dive into much of the bobcat management plan, but I did just want to touch on our three main goals, which is to first maintain or enhance the bobcat population in all areas of the state where suitable habitat exists. The second goal is to provide for the use sustainable use and enjoyment of bobcats by the public. And then the third goal is to ensure that we are meeting the public desire for information about bobcats and their conservation, use, and enjoyment. More information on our bobcat management plan is located on our website. So if you just go to our homepage, use a search bar to type in bobcat, you will be able to find our management plan. And we also have just a couple page version of the highlights of that plan too, if you'd like to check that out. So in order to achieve goal one of the things that we wanted to do was a species specific survey on bobcats. So we already had our Fisher cameras out and we were getting bobcats on those cameras, but we really wanted to dial in our efforts and specifically try to target bobcats to get some more information about them. So again, we worked with the New York Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit out of Cornell to develop this study. And we were trying to determine the occupancy and density of bobcats in New York with a special focus on central and western New York, where they are still fairly new to our area. The overall goal was to inform future bobcat management decisions and develop a population model that incorporates both harvest independent and harvest dependent data. So data, that we're collecting from the hunters and trappers during the season to estimate population trends. We launched this in the summer of 2023, and the study is comprised of two components, and we'll talk about both of them. So the first component is a non-invasive trail camera study, and the second component is some live trapping and GPS collaring. So we had 5 study areas across New York in regions 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And most of those study areas consisted of a 72 site grid. Region 6 was a little bit smaller, 49 camera sites there. Each site was spaced approximately a half mile apart. And then the bobcat collaring that we were doing as a second component of the study was taking place within the participating regions. But you can see, where those, where the stars are. That's where we are focusing the camera portion of the work. So the first thing that we had to do is take those spacing parameters and determine where we could put a camera. We were looking for trails, logging trails, game trails, ATV trails that were infrequently used. Habitat breaks was another thing we were trying to key in on, such as hedgerows, beaver swamps, early successional habitat, or forest edge. Those were all things that, we were looking for, usually starting with an aerial imagery search, trying to hone in on locations. But another key component of this project was participation from private landowners. So just want to take a second to give a shout out to everyone who participated. It was a large project, and we do not have enough state-owned land to be able to conduct a study like this without the private landowners allowing access to their property. And that goes for the Fisher work that we just talked about, and the work that Mandy will talk about in a little bit with the Otter work as well. So our relationship with private landowners is really excellent, and we value that a lot. Here's a couple of photos of some sites and what they actually looked like on the ground. Both of these locations were repeat Bobcat detections over a few year period. So we had an early successional site where it was right on the edge of some recent logging for a stand of young forests. And that was a site that we were getting a lot of different animals on, but repeat Bobcat detections. And then this beaver swamp site where you can't actually easily see the dam, but it is there. There's a dam very close to that site, and where a swamp is meeting an upland type habitat, and we had repeat detections at that site as well. All right, so a little bit different than our methods for the Fisher survey. We were using 2 cameras at every single site. So that's why in this beautiful photo of this bobcat posing for us, it's what it looks like. You can see a camera behind that bobcat. So we've got 2 cameras slightly offset, and the reasoning behind that is to try to maximize our opportunity to get as much information from that photo as we can on that individual bobcat. We also used a CD with ribbon as a visual attractant because bobcats are very attracted to flashy objects, feathers, that kind of stuff. They're very visual. We used a commercial trapping lure to try to encourage the bobcat to not only walk by the camera, but also hang out there for a little bit, which is what you can see on the right-hand side. Both of these bobcats are rubbing up against this. One's a stick, one's a rock where we put that lure. And all of the cameras that we had out were out at the exact same time. So our survey period of 3 months in the summer, every site was functioning all at the same time. All right, so the second component of our study was collaring individual bobcats to obtain detailed movement information. You can see this bobcat does have a GPS collar. This is a photo that was submitted by a landowner who had a camera out scouting for deer or whatever they were looking for, and this bobcat walked by and they contacted us and said, hey, I got this picture on my camera, could you tell me more about it? And that was one of our study animals. So the summer of 2023 is when we started our camera work. In the fall and winter and spring of that year, so 2023 into 2024, we worked with licensed trappers who were participating as part of this project to trap and collar bobcats. We again went back out and did the same thing in the fall and winter and spring of 2024 and 2025. So the bobcat trappers were using a standardized protocol that went into detail on every aspect of being able to do this in a way that would cause the least disturbance to the bobcats. There were factors of when they could trap as far as the temperature and weather, and there goes my light motion sensor. I'm just going to stand up and get that turned back on maybe, or maybe not. Sorry, guys. Hang on 1 second for me to just walk. I apologize. That's what I get for being the only one in the office right now. Anyway, so they had a standardized protocol of how to, how to check those traps and get in touch with the folks who are going to respond for the project, come out and immobilize those animals, process them, and take biological information. And then if they met the criteria for collaring, they would get a GPS collar. And you can see here, just based on the participating regions, we have, let's see, 16 total bobcats collared over the 2-year period. And this chart goes through the number of bobcats that were captured and then the number of bobcats that received a collar. So we captured way more males than females and had a larger number of males collared as well. And from that information, we were able to get really great movement data on these bobcats. So this image is several bobcats out in region 4. The GPS collars were programmed to record 1 point every 24 hours from the time that bobcat was trapped until April 1st. At that point, the bobcat collar switched over to collecting 1 point every 2 hours. So on average, we received about 900 points per bobcat. And from that, we were able to get some valuable information on the home range of these animals. The female bobcats have a significantly smaller home range than the male bobcats. And it does seem like they're selecting for the higher quality habitat as well. We also collected the health data on every captured bobcat. So even the bobcats that did not receive a collar, they still gave us valuable health data. And one of the interesting findings from that is that 25% of the bobcats that have been trapped for the project had been exposed to H5N1, which is a strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza. 3 of the bobcats collared died during the study. One of those was actually from avian influenza, which was very interesting. One was from unknown causes and one was harvested. And the data from this will be used to inform our modeling by giving valuable home range and habitat use information. So piecing this all together, we have these 2 components of the study. One is the trail camera survey, and the other is the GPS collar information. And what are we going to do with that? So we had 134 bobcat detections over those 2 summers, and staff looked at those images and were able to identify some unique features on some of these bobcats. So for this particular bobcat, it was the distinctive barring on the inside of the front leg. For others, it could have been a notched ear. One had, it didn't have a tail, which I'm sure it's got quite the story to tell about that. So interesting features that that we could, identify as unique. So 15 individuals were identified as unique individuals on multiple cameras. And with that information, we're able to use a spatial capture recapture method in which we will, instead of just knowing that we have a bobcat on the camera, but we don't know how many, we can tell that we've got more than one individual using that model. That model will also incorporate the movement and habitat modeling that we're getting from the GPS collars to produce an aggregate level density estimate. So what's next? So we are done with the fieldwork portion of things, and the analysis is in progress right now. Ultimately, the information that we get from this project will be used to inform future management decisions and identify additional research needs. All right, Mandy, it's back to you.
Well, thank you, Jen. Appreciate it. Let me grab presenter mode back here. Oh, thank you, whoever gave it to me. All right, so I am going to talk a little bit about some of our river otter research that we've been doing and their status in New York. So just a really quick, brief overview of the history of river otter in New York. So historically, they were found statewide. They were extirpated from the Long Island area by the mid-1800s, and then extirpated from most of Western New York by about 1930 or so. They did remain abundant in portions of Eastern New York, particularly in the Adirondacks, but also in the southeastern New York. But they were functionally gone from a large chunk of the state. And so in the 1990s, DEC started talking with some other partners, and we founded the New York River Otter Project, which was essentially this collaborative group of DEC, a couple of different nonprofits, and also private individuals who were determined to bring river otter back to Western New York. And so this initiated this reintroduction project that happened from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. And I mentioned it briefly earlier on, but essentially we relied on trappers to put out live traps for otters, capture otters in these areas where they are abundant. So in this map here, those areas in red are where otters were trapped from. So primarily in northern New York, but also there were some captured from southeastern New York as well. And then these otters were moved to western New York and released at 16 different sites throughout the area. All told, we released 279 river otters in the central and western part of the state, which was really exciting. You know, it was a really big deal at the time. So river otter reintroduction is something that many states have now done. And our project here in New York served as kind of a guide for several other states who were doing reintroductions of their own. So then, you know, we were kind of left with this, okay, we did this reintroduction. This is awesome. We know that we have some river otters there. And this really spawned a lot of different research projects into how are otters doing. So there were a couple of different graduate students who did some survival work and whatnot. But after kind of the buzz of the reintroduction, it kind of died off a little bit. So Region 9, so Jen's region, was really on the ball, and they went out and they were still doing regular bridge-based sign surveys. So essentially going out to several different points in the recovery area and surveying for otter signs. So they're looking for things such as slides, otter slides in the snow, tracks, looking for scat, which is known as latrines. So river otters often communally defecate in these areas known as latrines. Looking for anything that just shows that otter might be present at a site. So they did this for many years after the reintroduction. And the other major thing that we did is, well, okay. So from Region 9 stuff, we learned a lot about kind of how otters were moving throughout the reintroduction area. So like I said, you know, the last otters were released in the early 2000s. And then with our staff going out, we found that the number of areas with otter sign really stayed pretty stable for the first several years after the reintroduction wrapped up, really for the first almost 10 years or so. So this is kind of what we think was going on here was these otters were kind of exploring their new environment. So, you know, we hadn't had otter here in about 100 years. So they're really checking out to see what's around, what the habitat is like, and kind of establishing themselves. So this was known as the kind of exploratory phase, and it's very common in reintroduction projects. And then after 2010, we saw this period where all of a sudden otter sign was being found at a lot more sites. So this showed this population growth, that the otter population in Western New York seemed to be doing really well, and grew, and then was kind of stable for several different years. And the other thing that we did is we actually collected observation sightings. So I mentioned earlier on that we have our public sighting survey. So we had a version of this that was open for the public, and we also collected observations from trappers and bow hunters as well, and asked them to report any sightings. And so we were getting sightings from Central and Western New York. So we knew that overall it seemed like otter were doing pretty well there. You know, we were still getting reports of them decades after we had reintroduced them. But that being said, we didn't necessarily have this really kind of standardized, we hadn't gone out on the ground, with the exception of these limited sites in Region 9, to see how river otter were really doing. So, you know, here we are about 20 years after this reintroduction wrapped up, and we were kind of left with this, you know, how are otter doing in New York? And so in order to really get at this question, DEC partnered with SUNY ESF to develop a survey where we could go out during the winter time. So we used the stuff that we got, what we learned from Region 9, go out during the winter and be surveying for river otters. And really the goals of this was to document the population trend and the status within specifically the recovery area, but we also wanted to get a good idea throughout the rest of Southern New York as well. So, you know, in these portions of Southeastern New York, we had a harvest season for river otters for decades. We knew that otters seemed to be doing well, but we wanted to do this really kind of comprehensive survey, and we figured that it would be good to be able to compare the recovery area to areas that we knew had a robust population. So we surveyed pretty much all of Southern New York, and we also did some surveys on Long Island, because we knew that we were getting some reports of otter on Long Island, but didn't necessarily have a really great idea of how they were doing there, as they're kind of naturally recolonizing that area. So we wanted to get an idea of population trend, and also look at habitat preferences of river otter and what the potential habitat might look like in some of these different areas. And another big takeaway from this is we really wanted to develop a monitoring protocol that we can be using into the future to continue to keep tabs on our otter population. Especially as, you know, they may reach a level where we can sustain some level of harvest. So having this monitoring protocol is really, really beneficial for us into the future. And so we went out, we had all of those grid cells. We essentially broke up Southern New York into different grid cells. And then we sampled at least 4 different sites, so water bodies, in each of those grid cells. And again, we were surveying along shorelines of different water bodies and looking for the signs of that otter were present in the area. So here's just an example of an otter slide. And then we also have this otter scat here. So you can see some of the fish scales and whatnot that really kind of show that this is otter scat. And all told, we ended up doing surveys, and so we did some surveys in 2017, 2018, and 2022, with 2017 being kind of a pilot year to figure things out, and then 2018 and 2022 being our really big survey years. And we surveyed about 1,200 different sites each of those years. So we really covered this area very, very well. We did a ton of work. Very grateful for all the biologists and technicians who were out there during winter looking for signs of otter. And in 2018, you know, we detected otter at 11% of the sites surveyed. In 2022, it was up a little bit, and we detected otter at about 13% of sites. So we actually we detected otter at more locations in 2022. And so, the real kind of takeaways from all of these surveys, we learned a lot also about the habitat use of otters. So we found that we sampled pretty much all different water bodies. We found that otters were more likely to be found in ponds and wetlands compared to lakes, streams, and rivers. So they may be called river otters, but that's not necessarily where you're most likely to find a river otter. They were also more likely to use areas with recent beaver activity, which was really not a surprise. We know that there's a link between these two species. They like using ponds created by beavers. They will use some beaver lodges and things like that. And we also found that they're more likely to be found in areas where there was more forest and less roads. And this is just kind of a map of our habitat quality. So, high quality being the kind of the light white pink, and then the lower quality being this green. So you can see, unsurprisingly, northern New York has a lot of really high quality habitat for river otters. There's a lot of water up there, a lot of different shoreline, a lot of forests, not that many roads. And then in central and western New York, there's less high quality habitat, but there were still lots of otters. And I do just want to note, so Long Island, we got a lot of really good information on where otters are found on Long Island. This habitat map may not be super representative because otters are using very different habitat on Long Island. So, it's hard to make these statewide kind of comparisons when down there they're using a lot of brackish water and whatnot. So using some very different habitats than what we expect in other parts of the state, which is really neat. And we're hoping to do some more work on otters and figure out more about our otter population there on Long Island. So overall, there was about a 40% chance of river otters using any given water body statewide. So I know, that can be kind of confusing to folks, like, oh, well, why aren't they using all the water bodies? And it really kind of comes down to otters are a little bit picky. So they are what we consider an indicator species. They tend to use high quality habitat. That's one of the reasons why they suffered this really big decline in the during the 18 and early 1900s, is that water pollution really, really went up, and the water quality was just not good enough to support otter populations. And now with a lot of our water quality, like water pollution control that we do and whatnot, a lot of the water bodies have gotten way, way better. But it's not just every water body is suitable for river otter. So it was about, this about 40% chance of river otters using any given water body. And what was really cool is that what we found is that they were using just about like that chance of finding a river otter was just about as high in the recovery area in central and western New York as it was in parts of eastern New York, where again, we knew that we had a robust otter population. So there may have been less suitable habitat, but it was actually seeming like river otter have come pretty close to saturating the available high quality habitat in the recovery area, which is very exciting. And so our major takeaways from this work is that the reintroduction was a success, which is great. So otters are widespread across the recovery area and are using most of that high quality habitat that exists there. And it seems like the populations are at least stable, if not growing. So we are going to really kind of get at that and see if these populations could still be growing. We're continuing to work with ESF to monitor otters across the state. So we're going to be repeating river otter surveys this winter to see whether that upward trend of 11% to 13% continues, so to see if that population does seem to still be growing, or if it seems like they've kind of stabilized and they have kind of saturated the available habitat. And we are also working on finalizing our river otter management plan, and this plan will be guiding our river otter management for the next 10 years. And that is overall what I have here on river otters. I do just want to send a quick reminder before we head into our final presentation of the day. If folks have questions, please drop them in that Q&A. We'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone may have throughout. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jolie Tooley.
Thanks, Mandy. All right. So now we're going to talk about an opportunity for the public to get involved in, surveying for wildlife. We've talked a lot about what the DEC has done to look at different mammal species and furbearer species throughout the state. So I'm going to be introducing the project that we're calling SnapShotNY. Right, move this slide. We kind of talked about this already in the previous discussions, but I'll just briefly remind everybody that some of the methods for monitoring furbearers specifically in New York State are things like harvest reports, public sightings, and then the live trapping surveys that we talked about, as well as the camera trapping kind of on those smaller regional scales, looking at specific species like fisher and bobcat. And while these methods are very important and give us a lot of important information, especially with the harvest reports, you get a lot of good information on those species that are managed. However, they don't necessarily give us the best estimates of large scale, populations across the whole state. So they can introduce some bias. Mandy mentioned that, hunter and trapper participation kind of depends on a lot of different factors like weather and, if these people can even get out there and do trapping that year. So it really varies from year to year what the hunter and trapper participation is. And so it may not be the best method to estimate some populations across the whole state. As well as some of the other methods like live trapping and camera trapping, they are very labor intensive. And as she mentioned with the otter survey, people are going out, in the dead of winter and looking for otter sign. And that takes a lot of time and maybe isn't the most fun way of surveying for things, but these are some of the methods that we have been using and continue to use. One of the problems that the DEC has run into when trying to monitor for these species is that there's just simply not enough time or resources to survey for every single furbearer or mammal species throughout the state. And while we do have a lot of beautiful, natural landscape in New York that is protected and managed by the state, still 60% of the state is owned by private landowners. And we do have an awesome group of private landowners participating in all these different projects, but it's not necessarily reliable all the time, and we can't get that type of participation across the state a lot of the times. And so a solution for this was to develop a hybrid monitoring system. So basically we have a state-run component where they will be surveying for all these different mammal species across the state using trail cameras. And then a secondary component of a more community-focused project, the SnapShotNY portion of it, for citizen scientists to get involved and put trail cameras on their privately owned lands. So we have kind of a dual system going on here. So SnapShotNY, just in general, it has been a collaborative project that's been developed between the DEC as well as the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Cornell University. And the goals of the project are basically to collect as many trail camera images as we can of as many species of interest as we can, including things like bear and bobcat and deer, as well as fisher and moose and a whole slew of other species as well. And then secondarily, the second goal is that we want to engage the public in this data collection. So we do have things like those sighting surveys for people to report when they see these animals. But SnapShotNY kind of offers a more direct way to get involved, where you have a trail camera on your own property and you can kind of see what wildlife is going on right where you live. So get more involved in the data collection portion And then to just generally expand the knowledge of the status of mammal species in New York, we do these targeted surveys on species like bobcat and fisher, and so we can get a better idea of those guys. But when you're looking at kind of a wide range of species, it's kind of better to survey the whole state so that we can get information on more mammal species. So the kind of data that Snapshot collects has been mentioned in some of the previous talks, but I'll just go over it quickly again. We do detection, non-detection data is what we're collecting through these cameras. And that simply means, you know, are we detecting a species? Yes, then they're there. And if we're not detecting a species, they're either not there or they were there and we didn't see them. So that kind of ends up being like a binary 1 and 0 situation, whether they're there or not. And from this detection, non-detection data, we can ultimately determine some things like population trends over time. We can kind of monitor and track which populations are increasing or decreasing throughout the state. We can also determine things like sex ratios, how many males to females there are, and as you've learned from previous presentations here, that is an important metric to know for, you know, different hunting and trapping portions of getting involved with wildlife here. And then we can also determine some juvenile and adult ratios as well. And distribution, so that means basically just where are these animals on the landscape. And then a more specific metric is density. And we can only determine this for, you know, certain species where we are able to identify down to the individual. And so that just means we know the number of animals in a given area. And on the image on the screen is a map of the density estimates of moose in the Adirondack Park. And you can see where the darker red and orange is the higher densities and the green is the lower densities. And so hopefully we can do this for some other species as well. So if you want to get involved in Snapshot New York, I'll just briefly go over kind of how it works and what the involvement process is. So the first thing you want to do is go to our website and check that out. It has a lot of useful information about the project. And it also has information on just the mammal species that we have in New York. So if you're looking to learn more about that, we do have a page for that as well. And it's a pretty simple process. You just go and sign up for an account and fill out your profile information. And then once you do that, you're going to need to select a grid cell. So the way that Snapshot New York works is there's 4,500 grid cells divided up throughout the state. And each of those grid cells is 30 square kilometers. So the reason why we chose 30 square kilometers is that kind of ends up being a rough average of some home range sizes of one of, you know, some of the larger mammals that are in the state. And so by spreading out the grid cells, we kind of reduce the chance that we're going to see the same individual, you know, on different cameras in different grid cells. So putting them spatially farther apart helps. And kind of in the same vein, we are also putting one camera per grid cell, or having the volunteers put one camera per grid cell. And that's because of the type of data that we're collecting. So I mentioned the detection, non-detection data. If you add more cameras, it doesn't necessarily give you more information, because we're saying, yes, this species is present, or no, it is not. And so if you just have more cameras, you're just getting more yeses or more nos. And also, it's just a lot of data to collect, since it is a statewide project. And so limiting it to one camera per grid cell kind of allows us to manage that data a little bit better. And we do understand that, you know, a lot of people would want to participate and don't necessarily, you know, understand why we're only doing one camera per grid cell. And so we did develop a waitlist feature for folks, and you can still click on a grid cell that is taken and be put on a waitlist, because people are always, you know, maybe dropping out of the project, they don't want to participate anymore, or they were interested in having their camera out, you know, just during the hunting season. For a variety of reasons, people will be sending back, you know, any lone cameras, or they will no longer need their grid cell. So you can get on a wait list for that. And after you have a grid cell selected, you are going to deploy your trail camera. So we developed a custom built app to do so. And this is a really important step in the process because this gives us all the information about your trail camera. So we're going to collect things like the camera brand, what height you put it on the tree, you know, which direction is it facing, north, south, etc. And it also collects the date that you put out your camera automatically for you, as well as the time that you start it. And it has a map feature. So if you take your phone, since it has GPS on your phone, you can just go out to the camera site and the map will pop up with a pin of your location. So you don't have to worry about, typing any coordinates. So trying to make that as streamlined as possible for folks. And then once you have your camera deployed, you're going to leave that out for, a couple of weeks and go in and check on it and pull the SD card out of the camera to upload your photos through our website. And I do have a few images from the project that we've collected so far in the background there. And once we have these images uploaded, we'll be able to use all this data to kind of continue to inform the management and conservation of these mammal species throughout New York State. And kind of similar to the things that we've already been mentioning, we can, set these expectations for population trajectories, which can inform these various management plans for species. And we can do things like set annual tag allocations or potentially modify things like bag limits and seasons lengths, all these things that we've been talking about throughout this webinar. And it can also inform any sort of habitat management that we'd want to do for species that are in need of more conservation. So this is kind of both a, game species and non-game species project. We're kind of collecting images of pretty much everything that we can catch on camera. So just a little bit of information about the current status of the project. We did officially launch it to the public at the end of June. And we've had a pretty steady incline of people applying to the project. And we now have over 850 grid cells across the state selected. So you can see on the map on the top, all those red grid cells are where people have selected those. And then on the map at the bottom is all the locations where we have cameras currently deployed. And I mentioned at the beginning that this is a hybrid project. So we are having DEC staff do some surveying for the project as well as our volunteer scientists. So the volunteer scientists are in blue and the DEC staff is in red down there. And we do have a loan a camera project through Snapshot. However, we have sent out all of the ones that we had available, which was around 340. And we still have a lot of people on the wait list as well for all the different grid cells across the state. And I'm also taking a wait list for people who want to request a camera loan. So if you don't have your own, you can always request to get on the wait list for a loan camera as well. And I just checked recently and we have now over 2.3 million photos submitted. So that's really amazing. We've already collected a really large amount of data within the couple of months that we've been running the project. And granted, these are not all pictures of wildlife. Your camera's going to take pictures of wind and trees blowing, but still, it's a lot of exciting data. And people are still applying, and we're still trying to fill out the gaps in the state. You can kind of see on the map, the upper map, we do have a bit of space up in the Adirondacks where we don't have as many cameras, and that's kind of to be expected. There's less people living in those regions. There's a lot more just wild land out there. So kind of my next step is to, as the community science coordinator, is to kind of reach out to these areas where we need more surveying done. And this slide is just sharing a few of the photos that we have collected from our wonderful citizen scientists so far. So we're getting pretty much everything on camera from, bears, bobcat, fox, fisher, down to squirrels. So we're getting it all. And that's really all I have. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who is already participating in Snapshot, as well as everyone who's been involved in the project, including DEC staff and Cornell staff. And I just wanted to share some of our social media links so you can follow and stay updated on Snapshot, and some of my contact information here. And that QR code will bring you directly to our website as well. And if you have any questions about the project, you can always email the SnapShotNY@cornell.edu. I try to stay really on top of that email because I get a lot of questions about the project. I haven't been looking at the Q&A, so I don't know what's been going on here. Explain. Okay, yeah, so the Snapshot New York app is specifically for recording information on the trail camera. We call it a deployment of a camera, so when and where you put the camera out. And we are not able to upload photos through the app. That is a process that has to be done through the website. And the reason for that is that a lot of trail cameras take SD cards. There are some cellular cameras that get photos sent directly to your phone, but most of them take SD cards, which you have to put into a computer to read and get those photos off of there. So that's why we're doing photo uploads through the website. And you asked how specifically to get the pictures. A lot of people are asking if they can just, send a few pictures from their trail cams to the email, but we do need it in a structured way. So we do need it to be uploaded through that website account portal. So that's the one below there that says app.snapshotnewyork.org. That's where all your personal account information is going to be, where you can see your specific grid cell and your specific camera deployments. Yeah, so I think that was really the only question on there. So feel free to add any more questions if you have them, but if not, yeah, you can contact me at the emails listed.
Julie. All right. Well, we appreciate everyone hanging on here till almost 8 o'clock and spending the last 2 hours of us on this beautiful fall day. Here's your chance. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them. You got a whole crew of folks here. So if you type it into the chat for everyone to see, we can answer them. We'll give it, a minute or two. And if you have no questions, just thank you for attending and for taking the time. And we will be sending out some links with this on our Gov Delivers, probably on our social media a little bit, and try to get these out there for everyone who wants to see them or share them with other people who might be interested in some of the information that the biologist shared tonight. All right, not seeing anything. Thank you all and have a good night.